Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. We are talking today on the 19th of September when there are news reports that there were some pager attacks or pager bombings for Hezbollah in Lebanon. And a few days later, there were some similar sort of interventions on walkie-talkies, which Hezbollah fighters and people associated with were using. So we thought we'll have this episode and we'll discuss the supply chain security aspects of it and what it means for India and other things. And for that, we have a perfect guest today. We have with us KPM Das, and he has worked on several aspects of supply chain security before from a technical perspective. And we thought we'll get a good understanding of what the real issues are from him. So welcome, KPM, to another episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you, Pranay.
So, KPM, let's start from the beginning. First, when this news happened about the pagers blasting off, the first instance, people thought, there were some chip hacks or there were some implanted signals which were given and that led to this things happening. But after a few hours, I think the situation got more clearer and it seems like it was more cruder in the sense that there were some explosives put in and then they were sort of blasted off remotely. So could you explain actually what happened and what do we know in this instance from a technical perspective?
Right. So firstly, this is just to summarize, it happened on a very fine sunny mid-afternoon at multiple locations, and is in some way conflated with the ongoing conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. And we are all aware of Israel's ascendancy and the high technology ground that they hold. But all things considered, I think no one, including Israel watchers, Middle East watchers, tech buffs, were prepared for something like this.
Absolutely.
It was something which was in a completely different orbit. And clearly, like you said, initially the pointers were towards cyber because cyber is something that is more, you can apply it widespread, it rides on internet and so on and so forth. But I think within a few minutes or hours, it became pretty clear because when the targets were identified, target platforms were identified to be legacy, first generation, low-cost, zero-cost platforms, then we knew it had to be something else.
Right. Yeah, and initially, as you were mentioning, there was this speculation that there were cyber or hardware hacks. And then it sort of started becoming clearer that there were some explosives put in, etc. But how does this actually happen? What would it take for this kind of thing to have happened? Like some people do say that in Lebanon, these pagers started coming in only a few months back, and probably there was a single supply chain. I'm sure it's not a very diversified supply chain who uses pagers nowadays. So was it that another actor got hold of the company which was supplying these pagers and then would have bugged these, or how do you think it appears?
Yeah, sure. So even as we speak this morning, right, we are close to about more than 40 hours after the initial event. The jury is still out on details.
Yeah.
But we do know a few things. One is clearly this was in some form a kinetic attack, right? So you, like all these attacks, it has got three pillars on which one is the operational pillar, the second is the technical pillar, and third is the logistics pillar. This is a classic supply chain attack. And to your point about legacy stuff, it is not uncommon. It is there are special forces, there are military organizations and teams which continue to use legacy platforms. We have people who use 386s even now in large numbers.
Yeah.
The people who still code in Fortran 77 or in COBOL for reasons, there are certain reasons. So legacy still has a place in some parts of this operational milieu. But what actually happened to my mind is there are multiple possibilities. One is all electronic devices need power, and power is normally through a battery. And given that these are commercial devices, it is going to be a replaceable battery. So the initial thing pointed out to the batteries itself being spiked, control over the current cycle, and which then causes a spike, and then it leads to a kind of an explosion of the device. And we've been seeing this often, even while charging phones and so on. But this clearly was in a different league altogether.
Yeah, because that kind of explosion, the signature of the things that happened was very different from what a battery explosion would cause.
Two very interesting things. There were no flames.
Right.
The second thing is, so there are candidate explosives that could have been inserted. Clearly, they were inserted. And it appeared that one of the strongest of them, which is maybe more than 66% higher than TNT, was used. And the form factor is so small that you clearly couldn't pack in anything beyond 3 to 5 grams. Two, many of these explosives are actually quite passive. They need to be detonated. They need to get a flash. And that comes from another little thing, which is often called the detonator, right? So there has been an electronic event inside the platform. There's been detonation, and then you had this boom, something in the range of more than, at least to my mind, 1,000 meters per second to have caused this. Yeah. And remember, this whole timing had to be within a period of a few seconds, because clearly I think this was rehearsed, this was practiced, that from the time you pick up the phone or you respond to the pager till the time you look at the message, there's a period of about 3 to 4 seconds. And that, I think, was the golden hour that was used by the attackers. So this is a mix of timing, accuracy, lethality, secrecy, because there are stories going around that a couple of Hezbollah folks actually had suspicions on these devices, right? But they did nothing about it. And we'll come to that later, because this whole OPSEC is the other area which has actually defeated them.
Great. So, as you said about the legacy stuff, now we know something similar had happened in 97 as well, on a very small scale. They're targeting one fighter in Gaza, I think. But this is sort of happened at a very large scale and in a coordinated way. Now, I'm sure the exact details are not out, but if you had to try to guess, the fact that these attacks happened simultaneously in different places, would it have been remotely triggered through some RF signal, because pagers are unencrypted, and that would have then caused the detonation, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, so if you get down to the platform of the pager, or if you even look at what happened 24 hours later, which was ICOM V82s, right? In both these cases, the trigger is a spike above a normal in current. Now, how you bring that about could be through firmware, and you have a timestamp in the firmware. This is a little more complex, yeah. Or it could simply be a radiation, right? And which is driven either through some kind of a jamming kind of a thing, which people have done. There are instances where it's been done. But in this case, it more appears to be a conventional broadcast channel for the pager, right?
Which is an RF signal.
If you look at a pager, initially you get a buzz, and then you get a sequence of buzzes, and that's when you're expected to look at the message that is there. And look at the people who've been impacted, right? They are very senior folks. So it's clearly at the level 1, what they call the O group, the operational group of Hezbollah. I mean, why would an ambassador of a country like Iran carry that same pager, which is carried by someone else in Hezbollah? So this is the command and control network, and clearly I think they captured the supply chain. And there are further details emerging now.
So again, if we were to guess, there is some change which would have been required to do in the device itself. So someone would have opened it and planted this explosives, and some change would have happened either at the firmware level. Yeah, definitely at the firmware level. It could be hard coded, or it could then be a spike in the signal which led to the current increasing beyond a threshold, and then it triggered this kind of device, right? So that's a very interesting operation. And do you think probably the similar mechanism would have been used for the walkie-talkies, you would say, or would it be different?
Right. So if you look at what happened later, during the funerals, people are more closer to each other. So the distance between people was less. So the damage was more. 500 people injured, 20 people died.
Right.
In fact, the reports are that the previous day, as many casualties were not there. So this was, to my mind, a different model thing altogether. And here probably it is because the voltages are higher. The voltages are higher in a ICOM. So it was clearly a different vector to my mind. It's not the same thing. And more importantly, see, what they've done, they fundamentally re-engineered the architecture inside the pager. It is not one person quietly, surreptitiously moving to the go down, picking up thousands of devices and going and inserting something. It's not as simple as that. There's been a re-engineering that's been done. There's been a lot of rehearsals which should have taken place because the kind of accuracy and precision that they achieved points to something, to a cycle of rehearsals till they converged on something which was a perfect cycle.
So you mentioned OPSEC a few minutes ago. So could you detail out that? What are the OPSEC issues here which you see have gone wrong and that has probably led to this?
Okay. So the news emerging is there's a very defensive Taiwanese company now saying we didn't do it. We have this licensing model and they licensed it out of somebody. And it now emerges that somebody was a one-man person, one lady company, CTO. That's it. So it was some kind of a trading company which had nothing except one-bedroom suites in Budapest. And therefore, I think right from the invoicing, the decision what to purchase, possibly Hezbollah is infiltrated as well. What is the platform to be purchased? How it's going to be invoiced? Who's going to do it? Setting up of the company. And so this appears to be 2 years in the works, 1 to 2 years in the works. And therefore, what has happened is right across the supply chain, there has been a complete compromise to the extent that it is very likely that this is probably just the trailer. There could be more on other platforms as well. But to me, at the end of it all, I think the biggest challenge for Hezbollah now is that their leadership has lost trust among their all ranks, foot soldiers. And that's something they'll have to rebuild. We'll see how it goes. It is also very likely that this supply chain compromise possibly would have been known to their allies. And that's going to be interesting. So we'll hear more about it in the coming days.
Right. And could you detail out more about this Taiwanese company that you're saying, in the sense that were they making the PCBs or were they making the chips or they were getting it from outside? So they would have received an order from this Budapest-based company. So what were these Taiwanese companies doing? Were they assembling the entire pager or were they assembling some components within it?
Yeah. So, these are OEMs. Original equipment manufacturers. They have a platform and it is in wide use. They also have said yesterday in their press statement that not only this company called BAC in Hungary, they have similar licensing models with many other partners. So this is not a big deal, is what they say. So from an OPSEC point of view, the things that actually have failed, one is for a military or a quasi-military organization like Hezbollah, they should have actually validated their supplier. They should have validated their supplies. They should have had ability to audit at least samples of what was delivered. They should have used some of them in a limited operation and then before they sent out hundreds and thousands of pages to people. So clearly those cycles were not followed. And it's not surprising because Hezbollah is more of a very agile, lean, mean organization. To me, it reminds me of LTT really, right? Extremely disciplined, very tight procedures, uncompromising command and control, right? I remember LTT used to, when they were on the radio, their messaging protocols were incredible. In fact, we learned a lot from them. Yeah. So for an organization like that, it is surprising that they did not put their arms around the supply chain.
Yeah, that's interesting. By the way, KPM is talking about these things because he was also a colonel in the Indian Army involved with signals. So he has lots of experience on these kinds of issues, on dealing with terrorist organizations, how they respond, how do you counter them, etc. as well. So KPM, let's go to the next stage where now the narrative building. I mean, one thing is about the Israel angle. So tactically and operationally, this is quite a successful operation. Everyone in the world is looking at it. We are talking about it. But we also know strategically, we don't know where this will take Israel, right? Maybe it will expand the scope of war and it might actually make things worse for Israel as well. We don't know about that. So we'll not discuss there. But from international relations perspective, it has sent this narrative across the world that supply chain security is supremely critical. Such a thing can happen. Now there's a live example. People knew that this could happen, but now it makes things very relatable when you see things happening around you, right? So now what would someone in the Indian government be thinking about? And second, what should someone in the Indian government be actually thinking about with respect to supply chain security?
I mean, I would expect the national, cybersecurity and the National Security Advisory Board to actually come together and have a, ab initio look at this whole set of principles which govern the supply chain. On paper today, India has some very strong supply chain directives, mandates, and regulations. But some of that is, a lot of it is on paper, and it doesn't have the matching capacity to audit, verify, validate, right? So if you go back to the famous Reagan thing about trust but verify, it doesn't hold anymore. So we are now moving to a period from implicit trust to something called explicit trust, which means you begin by saying that you don't trust a device, you don't trust a network, you don't trust an application. And there's a very interesting model. I mean, those people who are in technology and networks, you have the classic 7-layer model. You have the physical at the bottommost layer, you have application at the top. And we now recommend that, the network layer doesn't trust the physical, the application doesn't trust the network. So between every layer in the 7 layers, each of them are now expected not to trust the layer below. If that protocol is put in place, I think we are in good hands. It'll come at a high cost, both in terms of resources and time and so on. But I think we probably have to gather our thoughts again and apply some first principles to arrive at something which is workable.
Yeah. So again, first principle thinking on this one, the critical part of sort of the weak link in this chain was the fact that there was this one supplier and the fact that you had one OEM also which was supplying to all your products, right? So I think one basic thing you would think of is diversify the supply chain such that you don't have one single point of vulnerability, right? So that would be where you would begin. The other thing would of course be do more audits, do more security. What I fear, KPM, is that this might lead to the government thinking more about everything should be Atmanirbhar and everything should be made in India. And that, as you just said, that will increase costs. It also means we can't make chips right now. It will take 5, 7, 8 years for us to start making 28 nanometer chips. So obviously we can't become Atmanirbhar all of a sudden, and closing ourselves in this economy will be even more disastrous for us from an economic perspective. So given these constraints which are unique for India, how do you think we should approach this situation?
Yeah, so this is clearly a classic example of how you handle trade-offs.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
And there are multiple trade-offs at play. So you have indigenous manufacturers, you have OEMs, you have system integrators, you have vendors, you have distributors, right? So this makes up the whole supply chain ecosystem. And you have transporters, people who load and carry it from point A to point B. That's again a weak link. So I think clearly we have to draw a balance. So on a scale of 0 to 1, you can never be at absolute security, which is 10.
Yeah.
So what you get to a point that you look at it from a risk perspective. And this is something that I've always advised customers, that instead of, placing very hard red lines, pick up the scenario, do a risk-based assessment, and for those risks, for each of those line items, figure out how you're going to cover it. The challenge is this is a moving target, right? It's not static. It's extremely dynamic, right? What was secure yesterday is not secure today, because you have 0 day, you have day 1, you have day 2, and this is on the rise, right? So you forever are dealing with a moving target. So you clearly need to look at it from an architecture point of view, and then stitch together trusted pieces in a manner that you have a trusted ecosystem. So that is clearly the way to go. The problem with taking a completely Atmanirbhar stance is that very often many of our suppliers, especially in India, are still in early stages of maturity, right? Both in manufacture, in validation and testing. And all this comes at a cost.
Yeah.
Can they afford the cost?
Yes.
Will it stay competitive? And invariably, you will find that security takes, a second place as compared to things like cost and, L1 and so on and so forth. So this is something that I think leadership has to manage in enterprises, in governments.
Right. So just let's flesh out that risk assessment part which you said. So generally in risk-based assessment, the way we approach is risk is a product of the probability of something going wrong and the impact of what it causes. So for example, even though the probability of something hurting the Indian military might be low, but the impact that it will cause will be very high. So the risk of that is very high, and that's why probably you'll have to secure more of the military systems. Similarly, politicians are always in the limelight, so probability of them being attacked is very high, and the impact is also very high. So the product for them is very high. So would a risk-based assessment take into account the customers of these products and see that things which are going to our armed forces or things which are going to a bureaucracy, they are sort of the audit levels, etc., are very stringent there, and to a general population, to people like you and I, we don't need to worry about where these phones or others are coming from. Would that look like?
Yeah, true. Which is one of the reasons. So this whole matrix of risk is today the foundation for what is called the critical national infrastructure, right? 10 years ago, you only had probably telecom and military. Today, you look at countries, they've added sectors like health, transportation, oil and gas. Even education today is getting into critical infrastructure. So the whole idea is that out of the whole universe, you pull out those segments which you think are worth protecting and where there is a fair trade-off between cost versus effort. So this risk-based assessment is something that is very useful. I think it is not static. It needs to be done on a continuing basis. But what it gives you are options to secure your whatever is your critical infrastructure. And at least the governments that I have worked with, I know about Australia, I know about India, certainly about Indonesia. They're already adopting these approaches.
Yeah, but the trade-offs again are different from country to country, right? For example, there's a very nice article in Foreign Affairs by Dan Dresner where he makes this argument that when everything is national security, nothing is secured actually, right? Because you're expanding the scope to protecting so many things that you actually can't realistically do anything in these, and hence you will leave loopholes in many of them. So given that we are at a stage where, our GDP per capita is still low, we have to integrate with the world economy as well. We need to get capabilities from outside. So obviously, our sort of trade-offs might be very different from, let's say, what Australia or US might have. So from our perspective, what would be a common minimum program you can think of that these are the areas where we should focus our energy on, and where the trade-off is in favor of focusing more on security rather than diversification?
Yeah, sure. So without loss of trust, there are things that can be done, right? So one thing that is emerging now is something called the bill of material, right? So if you pick up a complex device like the router, you have something like about 50,000 components. And from a family point of view, there are at least 1,000 families inside. So what governments tend to do is they pick up those components which are active, not passive, identify those, which are not many, and then put your lens on those and have a traceability on the supply chain, right? As you walk through the supply chain traceability matrix, you get an idea of where the risks are, right? And there are today modalities by which in critical infrastructure, customers and governments seek to have commitments beyond the normal service level agreements. So this may even include visit to the factory where they inspect a certain sample and so on. The other paradigm change that's happening is a lot of hardware is now moving to software. So you have this hardware-software combo with a lot of software overlay where the controls plane and the management plane is in the software. So again, if you pick up a complex device, the software bill of material has something like about 30,000 open source components. And you're aware that most of the operating systems and core software, almost 60 to 70% is a straight pickup from open source, which exposes you further. Right. So there are today methodologies that are being developed. There are standards that are coming up. For a start, 28001 is a start in supply chain security, but I think we need to go a long way further. The other challenge that I see for governments and enterprises is very often compliance seems to be the end all of everything. Okay, you get a certification, put a tick mark, and you say, "Good, we are secure." Whereas smarter organizations actually customize those to their relevant, check sheets and build their own playbooks and then develop those. I think we need to move towards that. Often standards stop where the complexity begins.
Wonderful. So that's great. We got to know a lot from you, KPM, on this. And I'm sure this is a developing field. We'll also bring out some papers on this to understand what should be the next frontier of supply chain security and where should a government like India focus its energies on. So thanks a lot, KPM. This was fun. And for listeners, do keep an eye on these developments. These will cause ripple effects on the idea of supply chain security across the world. So let's keep watching and trying to understand how to develop lessons from these incidents. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.